The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on Scotland's Redress scheme for survivors of historical child abuse in care. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, on Thursday of last week, the Scottish Government introduced the Redress for Survivors Historical Child Abuse in Care Scotland Bill to Parliament. This bill is the result of the brave and tireless advocacy of survivors of historical child abuse in care and a reflection of this Government's unrelenting commitment to properly address what they have experienced. It delivers on many of the recommendations made previously by the Interaction Plan Review Group, whose continued work has helped to inform key aspects of the draft legislation. I thank the members of the Review Group and all the other survivors who have campaigned with such dedication and contributed in such a wholehearted way to our approach. The bill seeks to establish a financial redress scheme for those who were abused as children, while resulting in an eligible care setting in Scotland, where that abuse took place before the 1st of December 2004. Under our proposals, all survivors will have the opportunity to apply for a redress payment of up to £80,000. However, we recognise that survivors value having a choice, and building on the results of previous consultation, the scheme adopts a combination payment approach. This means that survivors can choose to apply for a fixed-rate redress payment of £10,000 or apply for an individually assessed redress payment, which involves a more detailed examination of the facts and circumstances of their experience. The scheme is designed to be survivor-focused in its processes and in its outcomes. I recognise that applying for financial redress may be a daunting prospect for some. However, support to apply to the scheme will be provided for those who wish it. This may involve emotional or psychological support as well as practical assistance. The bill also includes the necessary powers required to help those who need it with obtaining the supporting information and evidence required for an application. In certain circumstances, next of kin of eligible survivors may apply for a payment of £10,000. The scheme will be open for 5 years, although this term may be extended by ministers with the approval of Parliament. A new non-departmental public body, to be known as Redress Scotland, will be established to deliver independent decision-making on applications for financial redress. We are committed to seeking fair and meaningful contributions from those organisations who had responsibility for the care of children at the time of the abuse. We know from survivors that such financial contributions are important, and we continue to work with a range of organisations to facilitate that. This scheme offers those organisations the opportunity to address the wrongs of the past and, in doing so, to be part of a national collective endeavour built on compassion, integrity, fairness and respect. The redress scheme is designed to be an alternative to the traditional civil justice process. In accepting a redress payment, survivors will agree not to continue or raise a civil legal action against all those organisations who have made a fair and meaningful financial contribution to the funding of the scheme. For some survivors, this will be irrelevant because the operation of the law of prescription prevents those abused before September 1964 from pursuing personal injury actions in the civil courts. Indeed, the injustice faced by those survivors is one of the reasons that the scheme is being created. For those survivors, this bill may provide their only route to financial redress and the associated acknowledgement, accountability and justice that the redress scheme provides. For other survivors, they will have a choice. The scheme offers a more accessible, faster and non-adversarial process than litigation, a process centred around transparent practices and payment levels and access to support throughout their application and beyond. For these survivors, the redress scheme will offer choice in how to pursue financial redress where before there was none. I want to be absolutely clear that redress payments to survivors will not be dependent upon contributions being received. As a government, we recognise that it is our moral responsibility to provide financial redress, and we will not shy away from that. It is not possible to predict with accuracy the number of eligible survivors who may apply to the scheme. In this context, we estimate that the total cost of the scheme may be in the region of £400 million. Appropriate controls are built into the design and delivery of the scheme to ensure efficiency and robustness, whilst not compromising on the redress payments that will be made to survivors. For example, whilst decision-making will be carried out independently, for the purposes of efficiency, administration and processing will be carried out by the Scottish Government. We have also learned from other redress schemes which have seen significant expenditure on legal costs. By providing funding for independent legal advice, we enshrine a meaningful opportunity for survivors to access legal advice and assistance throughout the process, but we will also introduce reasonable limits into the levels of that funding. We recognise that more than financial payments are required to respond to the needs of survivors. The bill adds to a package of measures already in place, including the establishment of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, future pathways and the Survivors of Childhood Abuse Support Fund. The bill itself also enables elements of non-financial redress, such as therapeutic support, to be provided. For decades, survivors of abuse were not heard and not listened to, echoing how their voices as children were silenced. One of my priorities has always been to ensure that survivors' views have been at the heart of measures introduced to support them. The redress scheme again embodies that approach, and I am grateful for the responses to the pre-legislative consultation which have shaped the scheme. Engagement with survivors will continue, including the establishment of a survivor forum to ensure the needs and the perspectives of survivors are reflected in the implementation of the redress scheme. In terms of timescales, work is ongoing to allow the scheme to be launched as soon as possible after Parliament passes the bill, should Parliament be minded to do so. The Advance Payment Scheme, launched less than 18 months ago, has made over 450 payments to date to older and terminally ill survivors. As I have informed the Chamber before, the Advance Payment Scheme will remain open until the full scheme is operational. I acknowledge and I am grateful for the previous support that Parliament has offered in relation to measures introduced by the Government to support survivors of historical abuse. As scrutiny of the bill progresses, I look forward to continuing to build consensus and to working with colleagues from all parties to deliver a financial redress scheme that meets the needs of survivors. This abuse should never have happened, and with this scheme, we recognise the profound and enduring impact it has had and continues to have on the lives of so many. Children, often very vulnerable, who deserved love and care, instead suffered abuse and neglect, often at the very hands of those who were entrusted to protect them. Presiding Officer, there is no doubt in my mind that this bill is one of the most important pieces of legislation that this Parliament will consider in its lifetime. The impact on survivors of the Government, indeed of the country, facing up to its past is best described by those survivors. On receiving an advance payment, one survivor recently passed on a quote they had carried with them throughout their life, and that quote is as follows: "From inside these walls, no one outside heard our cries. When we left, no one heard our cries from within." Today, we hear those voices, those cries. With this bill, we again say to survivors, this should not have happened. We are sorry for what happened, and we will act collectively as a country to do all that we can to address the suffering that too many of our fellow citizens endured in their childhood.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Jamie Green to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by reassuring the Cabinet Secretary that these benches will support both the Government and this Parliament's efforts to do what it must to offer redress and right some of the wrongs of the past. We will do so constructively and sensitively. I will do so personally as a member of the Parliamentary Committee which will take the required legislation through. Inevitably, Cabinet Secretary, not everyone may be happy with our approach, nor every wrong will be righted. And we know that financial redress is not the only means to compensate, but for some it will make a difference. I will approach this bill the way I have approached others, including the Historic Pardons Bill, with the gravity that it merits. But these benches will also monitor plans and provide scrutiny or critique where it is required or indeed deserved. In that vein, may I start by asking the following. And the first is one that these benches have raised in the past, and that is the initial cost to set up and administer this scheme. Could the Cabinet Secretary offer some clarity as to what the Government thinks will be the baseline cost to set up and administer the scheme, irrespective of the volume of claims? Given that we do not know how many people may come forward to participate, the figure of £400 million was mentioned today, but on what modelling is that based? And will the totality of the compensation levels available be capped in any way, given that it is still an unknown? And finally, could we have any indication or insight into the eligibility criteria, any restrictions or any obvious limitations of the scheme, so that straight away we as a Parliament are managing expectations to those who are watching our actions with intent?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I thank Mr Green for his remarks, and I welcome the support and encouragement in principle of the Conservative Party behind the bill, and I commit myself, as I have done in the statement, to engage constructively to ensure that the legislation is as robust as it possibly can be, and informed by the evidence that the Government has already taken in the pre-legislative consultation, but which the Parliamentary Committee will obviously do as part of the normal legislative process. In relation to the financial issues, this is a notoriously difficult issue to predict, and what I can commit the Government to is to ensuring that the administrative process is efficiently established to ensure that payments can be made, and I'm satisfied with the progress that's been made in the advance payment scheme, which has been essentially a preliminary exercise for the bill, that has been done with financial efficiency at heart. It is, of course, a much more limited scheme because it only conceives of single payments of £10,000, whereas that proposition is inherent in this bill, but there is also the possibility of a much more considered and involved process in coming to a final payment, which will be reflected in the bill. The Government does not intend to set this up with a financial cap on it. It will be set up as a mechanism of making the payments, and obviously financial provision will have to be made for that, but then that is also underpinning the dialogue we are having with external organisations to secure their contributions to the scheme. And the final point I would make to Mr Green is the importance of ensuring that survivors are well supported to be able to come forward to make applications, but also to be well supported to have their needs met, which may not be addressed by financial issues. And in this respect, organisations like Future Pathways, I think, have contributed very significantly to building confidence, in helping to repair lives and rebuild lives among survivors, and obviously organisations of that type have a significant role to continue to play.
Thank you. Ian Gray, to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I really do welcome the introduction of this bill. I've said before, we have all let survivors down by taking too long to get to the inquiry, too long to address the time bar issue, and indeed too long to get to a redress scheme. It is critical then that we complete this legislation and we do not allow COVID or the impending end of this Parliament to derail that. And I very much welcome the Deputy First Minister's clear intention to deliver this, and we will certainly do all that we can to help. However, we cannot allow survivors to feel that we are somehow giving with one hand and taking away with the other. So can I ask, why are survivors expected to give up their rights to civil justice in order to access redress from the scheme? And secondly, how will the bill ensure that payments made under the scheme will not impact on recipients' rights to welfare benefits?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I welcome Mr Gray's remarks, and like him, I feel these issues have gone on for too long, and this is the moment to address them. And I make it absolutely clear to Parliament that I will be doing everything I possibly can do to ensure that this legislation completes its parliamentary passage before Parliament rises for the 2021 election. And I've given that commitment to survivors. I echo it. I've given that commitment privately to survivors. I have no hesitation in putting that commitment on the record publicly in Parliament, and it's my personal determination to make sure that we are able to do that. Mr Gray puts his finger on a very sensitive issue at the heart of the bill, which is about the question of whether survivors should be required to forfeit their right to civil action in exchange for participation in this scheme. And I recognise the sensitivity of this issue. The judgment that I've come to is that this bill provides the most reliable means by which an individual may be able to secure financial recompense for the suffering that they have endured. And in its broadest sense, that it will relieve them of a civil legal process about which they are not guaranteed an outcome, a positive outcome. It could involve a degree of personal and financial stress for an individual to pursue that civil legal action, whereas I consider this approach is more reliable. And crucially, by providing the waiver element within the bill, I think we strengthen the ability to secure contributions from organisations who will be able to address the wrongs that were committed by their predecessors in the past. Now, I appreciate that's a sensitive issue, and we will discuss that openly within Parliament, and we'll have to, obviously the terms of the bill are there for amendment, every single word of them. So that's the argument that I would put forward, and will be very happy to engage with it with Parliament to ensure that the issues are properly and fully addressed by the legislation.
Thank you. John Finney, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, President Officer, and I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of the statement, and commend much of the progress that's taken place over the years, not least most recently in relation to the P64 survivors. It was my intention to raise the point that Mr Gray raised there about signing away the rights, and the Cabinet Secretary may be aware of the upset and concern to survivors that that's caused, not least because, of course, payments are substantially lower than survivors might get in the court. What steps can the Cabinet Secretary take to allay the view that this bill could be seen as using a quick and easy money to protect institutions where abuse took place from paying out larger sums, particularly with regard to that term fair and meaningful, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I'm grateful to Mr Finney for his question. Essentially, the point that Mr Finney puts forward gets to the nub of the argument that Parliament has got to settle in arriving at the legislation. And in my judgment, having looked at the arrangements that we can put in place, the proposal in this bill provides a more reliable and dependable opportunity for survivors to be able to advance claims that they have, compared to the prospect of a civil legal action. Now that, I accept, is a matter of judgment. And it's a judgment that's been arrived at with extensive discussion with survivors, and by a genuine attempt to try to provide a reliable route that can be pursued by individual survivors. Parliament obviously will be free to consider the elements of the bill, and the Government will engage constructively in all of those elements. But fundamentally, what I'm interested in is using this bill to create an opportunity for survivors to be assisted to be able to address, with the help of the state, the unacceptable experiences that they have had. And it is the pursuit of that outcome that will underpin our involvement in all aspects of the legislative process.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Deputy First Minister for his statement. As convener of the Education and Skills Committee, who will be taking this bill through the Stage 1 process, I too understand how vitally important this is. We must get it right, and that involves also hearing the voices through the bill process of those who may be adversely affected. Given the interest that people will have of the bill process, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what support will be available before the redress bill is passed by the Parliament, hopefully, but what support is available for survivors now during that bill process, and what part the third sector will play in that process?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there are a range of organisations that already act in this area. I mentioned Future Pathways earlier on. There are a variety of other organisations who are providing services to survivors. I think one of the striking features for me of engaging with survivors has been the value that they attach to the support that they have and experience from the various representatives of organisations like Future Pathways, where the individual is at the centre of the support that's available, their needs are addressed and support is built around about them. And I think that's a model which serves us well, and that will of course be available to survivors as they proceed with issues advancing their interests in relation to this bill.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart, to be followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too want to associate myself and my party with the Deputy First Minister's sentiments and the tone of the statement. Financial redress won't make up for the injustices that were suffered, but it's an important step towards taking responsibility for the devastating impact on survivors' lives. The bill proposes that organisations with responsibilities will be asked to contribute financially to the scheme, and I recognise that part of my question may have been answered in previous questions, but does the Deputy First Minister envisage that the Government will play an intermediary role in brokering how that will work, given the range of parties involved, and how confident is he that organisations will cooperate?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Beatrice Wishart for her support for the direction of travel in the bill. The Government is already engaged in discussions with a range of organisations who we believe are organisations that should make a contribution to this scheme. Those discussions are being engaged in constructively by a range of different organisations, and obviously as these discussions progress, I will be in a position to advise Parliament of the commitments that have been made by different organisations at different stages of the proceedings. But I do believe it is important that organisations who have been responsible for the care of individuals in which children were abused have got to face up to these responsibilities and to make an appropriate contribution to the scheme.
Alison Harris, to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you. Whilst I see that in accepting a redress payment, survivors will agree not to continue to raise a civil action, legal action, etc., as per your statement. But what about the reverse of that statement? If a victim has already been through a civil court action, does that prevent them from then coming forward and applying through this bill for a redress payment?
Cabinet Secretary.
My recollection is that no, it doesn't. And obviously for an individual who is making an application to this, there's obviously a choice to an individual as to whether they participate in the scheme that's envisaged here or whether they decide to pursue a civil legal action. It's obviously a matter for those individuals. Now, of course, organisations could specify in the discussions that we have that if they have made payments before, they do not wish those to be associated with any applications made in this respect. And obviously the Government would have to consider these issues as part of the administration of the scheme.
James Dornan, to be followed by Joanne Lamont.
Redress schemes for survivors, and if so, can I ask how this has shaped the approach taken here in forward?
I'm not sure I heard all the question, but I think I got the drift of Mr. Dorn's question. There has been extensive dialogue through the interaction group with survivors to ensure that we hear their views, their hopes. That has taken time. It's taken care to make sure that we could reflect that properly and fully in the bill. Survivors have been very influential in shaping the approach that we've taken to the advance payment scheme, and I was keen that at all stages of these discussions survivors would be engaged in that process, and we will continue that dialogue in the period ahead.
Thank you. Joanne Lamont, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can point to the survivor groups which support his decision to deny survivors their choice to seek compensation from organisations for the terrible abuse they suffered, if those same organisations contribute to the redress scheme. And given that the Cabinet Secretary's statement says that survivors value having a choice, what is his response to those survivors who have spoken to me and have told me they are deeply offended and hurt by this decision to limit their right to seek compensation for the abuse they have suffered in the past?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the point I'd make to John Lamont is the point I made in response to Alison Harris, that a survivor can decide not to participate in this scheme, and they can pursue civil legal action if they wish to do so. Now, for survivors of abuse which predates 1964, this is the only option. I accept this is the only option, but that is an issue which is beyond my ability to legislate for, and the Government has moved significantly to create an opportunity for individuals to be able to pursue these issues should they choose to do so. So my point in response to Joanne Lamont is that survivors do have that choice if they wish to exercise it by pursuing a civil legal action. My argument is that there is the approach that is inherent in the bill gives survivors the opportunity to pursue that with a great deal more certainty of the outcome than they would have from a civil legal process, and also saving themselves significant personal and potentially financial distress in the process. But as I say, this bill will be the subject of dialogue and discussion within Parliament. I will engage in that discussion openly and constructively, and I encourage Joanne Lamont to do likewise.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having had the privilege of taking the Childhood Abuse Scotland Act, the limitation, the time bar bill through the Parliament, I'm very pleased indeed to see that the Cabinet Secretary has honoured his promise to survivors with this redress bill, and I commend him for that. Indeed, taking a civil action is not an easy thing in general circumstances. The time bar issue removed one hurdle. It did not necessarily mean that you could raise a successful action, or indeed that you would wish as a survivor to go through that very difficult process. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary on the key issue of financial contributions from relevant residential care providers? There's reference to certain tests to be met, including with regard to fairness and what is called meaningfulness of the relevant financial contribution. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to provide, in principle, a bit more detail about those tests? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful for the perspective that Annabel Ewing brings to the very challenging issues in relation to the limitations bill and the issues that are associated with it. In relation to the principles that will be deployed in relation to contributions, what we will want to be assured of is that the approach is proportionate, that it also takes into account the information that we have about the experiences that individuals have had and the responses of organisations, to ensure that in every respect we are properly and fully taking account of the experiences that individuals have had and the responsibility of organisations into the bargain, and how that can be properly addressed in the scheme that we develop.
Thank you very much. I'm keen to get the remaining questioners in, so can I ask please for sharply focused questions and answers. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I declare an interest in I have a constituent I've been working with the last 2 years who, after 44 years, has finally managed to get the accused charged and into court. And I want to state in the record that having worked in this case, the system that victims have to navigate is absolutely horrendous, re-traumatising the victim again and again. It's not fit for purpose, and I've written to both Mr Swinney and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Mr Youssef, to ask for their time to discuss this. However, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, given the Scottish Government's commitment to getting it right for every child, while the redress scheme only covers children who have survived historical child abuse and care, surely child abuse should be treated just as seriously, no matter the background or circumstances, for example in schools, and by not doing so is in reality secondary victimisation for those not included?
Cabinet Secretary.
The issue is fundamentally about the role, essentially, of the state. An example that Mr Whittle cites there about a young person that may have experienced abuse in a school, if they were still living in a domestic environment, then the circumstances are that the parent or carer was responsible for their care and the state was not acting on essentially any parental capacity, which is the scope of the bill that has been put forward. So it's where the state is acting essentially in the role of a parent and that abuse has occurred, that there is essentially a liability for that to be an issue that has to be addressed by the state, and that is the scope of the bill that's in front of Parliament today.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Can I advise how the Government will reach out to survivors who may live on the margins of society, such as homeless people or addicts, given that these are most likely to have had their lives ruined by abuse in childhood, and are that all those who should seek redress are aware of how to apply for it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Part of the experience of many of the organisations that deal with survivors is that they are often dealing with people who are immensely traumatised by their experience and can often be hard to reach within our society. Their confidence in those with whom they are in discussion has got to be built to enable that to happen. So there is extensive experience that's been built up over a number of years in essentially creating that approach to reach survivors, and I assure Mr Gibson that that thinking will be very much at the heart of the support that's in place to assist survivors and to support them in meeting the challenges they will have in interacting with a scheme of this type.
Thank you. Daniel Johnson, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And this has been touched on by Annabel Ewing, but the purpose of the new body will be to assess claims. Therefore, the methodology for doing that will be very sensitive indeed. So can I ask when the guidance for these assessments will be available, and how will it be devised?
Cabinet Secretary.
What we've tried to do with the bill, and the bill is extensive, is to put as much of the information to which Mr Johnson refers on the face of the bill, so that we are able to provide as much legal certainty as we possibly can do in structuring the bill. So I would rather have a situation where we have more of the fundamental components of the approach specified in law, rather than relying upon guidance to enable that to be taken forward. So there will be much greater reliance upon primary legislation, but the guidance will be formulated to operate within the terms of the primary legislation that's put in place by Parliament and available before the scheme is enacted practically, to enable it to resolve applications from individuals.
And finally, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The bill requires the provision of information and evidence in support of applications, and indeed gives power to compel any individual or body to provide specific information. What assurances, therefore, can the Cabinet Secretary provide that steps will be taken to ensure that, as a result of this process, victims will not experience re-traumatisation through applying for the scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that's a fundamental question, Presiding Officer, that all of us want to avoid being in any way the experience of individuals. This bill is designed to address or to help to address the unacceptable experience of survivors. It is an indication by the state of the importance we acknowledge in addressing those requirements. And the purpose of the process that we invite people to move through is to avoid re-traumatisation, to provide them with support, to enable them to participate in the process and to be able to have some benefit out of the outcome that is arrived at. So those aspirations will be built into the approach that is taken forward as part of the legislation to ensure that individuals are supported to address the unacceptable experiences they've had in the past.
Thank you very much. That completes questions on the statement, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business today is the election of a member for appointment to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. I have received one valid nomination for appointment. The nomination is Jackson Carlaw. Now, as this is an election, the Parliament is required to vote. So I'm going to suspend proceedings for a short technical break, allow all members to enter the voting system, and then we'll proceed to the vote. So this will be a very short suspension, and I suspend proceedings.